of relevance in relevance theory appeals to cognitive effects and processing effort, whilst the definition in affective science relevance doesn't involve those things, or doesn't appear to. A third difference is that in relevance theory, and this could be just a historical kind of accident, but I think it's true to say that most of the reactions we talk about in terms of relevance theory are non-demonstrative inferences. They are about propositional, often linguistic contents. In appraisal theory, for example, the reactions are not non-demonstrative inferences. They're not propositional. They're just emotional episodes, and those particular episodes may lead to further courses of action. And the final difference that we identified is that, again, there seems to be a tendency that relevance theory focuses, or work in relevance theory tends to focus on the so-called higher epistemic processes, so linguistic interpretation. Appraisal theory doesn't really talk much about epistemic processes. It's interested in emotions such as fear and joy. I don't really like the terms higher and lower, but I hope you understand, broadly speaking, what we're getting at. So basically, I want to just run through those four differences and suggest that they are only apparent, and that there are profound similarities, and that those similarities may lead us to a more unified idea of what perhaps relevance is in both domains of research, if you like. So I've just couple of brief bullet points there about the differences. The first two and the second two differences are broadly related, but let me just go through the kind of differences and whether they are apparent differences or real differences. So as I said, the term goal isn't used explicitly in the definition of relevance in the book, but as I say, it's clear that efficiency in information processing has to involve goals, and Sperber and Wilson are highly explicit about that. Moreover, if you actually force yourself to use the term goal, which seems to be a term that affective scientists do want to maintain, well, the search for relevance could well be interpreted as involving goals. So maximizing cognitive effects is a goal. Minimizing processing efforts is a goal. So both of the factors in the definition of relevance, theoretic relevance, can plausibly be understood as goals. Maximizing cognitive effects is a goal. And the second goal of minimizing processing effort is albeit special case of a very widespread goal in the animal kingdom, which is basically to avoid wasting energy. So that difference, that one is defined in terms of goals and one isn't, sort of melts away if you start perhaps using slightly different terminology to describe the relevance theoretic notion of relevance. The second difference was this idea of cognitive effects and processing effort, and that the notion of relevance in affective science doesn't appeal to cognitive effects and doesn't appeal to minimizing processing efforts. But as we've seen, if avoiding wasting your energy is a widespread goal in the animal kingdom, and it is, it seems to us that there will be perfectly sensible cases where you can describe emotional episodes which are, for example, motivated by minimizing efforts. So we tried to think of some examples, and the one that I think it was Constant came up with that I quite like is that you get home on a Friday evening and you've had a long week and you really fancy just sitting back and resting, And then you suddenly realize that you are faced with the realization that you have to do your tax files or something like that. That is likely to cause some kind of emotional or affective reaction. You might suddenly feel very weary, or you might feel very bored, or you might feel very lazy. And it seems to us that a plausible account of that kind of affective reaction is that the stimulus is appraised as obstructive to your goal of minimizing energy. So if that's the case, then processing effort or conserving energy may well be involved in affective episodes, and therefore is also a factor in affective relevance. So those are the first two differences, and we think they probably have, we hope you think they've melted away slightly. Those kind of reflections led us to a diagram which is in figure 1 on the handout. And I'll say a little bit more about what this diagram is in a moment. But the idea that we've been working with is that there is a kind of general kind of goal relevance that people have related to their goals and related to concerns. And then as subsets of both of those types of goal relevance, we have the two notions of relevance that we're looking at. Relevance as in relevance theory, and relevance as in affective science. Now, the important thing that I want you to bear in mind when you look at this diagram is that it's not a kind of hypothesis of what we think the different types of relevance are and where they belong. It's simply meant to correspond to the kind of sets of cases that have actually been studied in affective science and pragmatics. So in pragmatics, we tend to look at issues such as the epistemic propositional things, and in affective science, they tend to look at a different aspect of goal relevance, emotional episodes. We have the two sets interacting because there are, and this is related to a part of the conversation we had during Gemma's talk a couple of months ago, because there are what affective scientists call epistemic emotions. And one of the epistemic emotions is interest, where your response to an affective episode may well be that you want to improve your representation of the world or something like that, rather than simply escape a dangerous situation. So in that sense, the epistemic emotions relevance are ones that would fit with the relevance theory idea of relevance and the affective science one. Two more differences to look through. I mean, it is true that the third difference is that relevance theory tends towards the analysis of non-demonstrative differences and propositions and linguistic utterances. But as we all know, of course, it is not limited to those things. And relevance pragmatic can apply to non-communicated cases as well. And we do talk about this in the paper, although I'm not talking about it much here. And again, there's nothing about relevance theory that says it only talks about propositions. And in fact, as we all know, there's a lot of people working on non-propositional contents, whether they be literary effects or effects of artworks and things like that. And relevance theory by no means is just an account of propositions. And the final difference is that that I proposed is that, and it's related to the previous one, is that relevance theory just focuses on higher epistemic processes and appraisal theory focuses on lower processes. Well, that's probably the case in terms of, if you look at what the literature concentrates on. But there are many, many non-communicative, non-propositional cases that relevance theory does look at, which do not appeal at all to higher cognitive processes. And in fact, it doesn't say anywhere in relevance theory that the computation of effort versus effects is, well, it doesn't say anywhere that process is computational at all. And there's work by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber about this, about the search for relevance is a kind of comparable to other bodily processes where you monitor muscular effort according to effects gained. So this idea that relevance theory is just about the higher non-demonstrative inferential processes is really not true. And if that's the case, then all four of the differences have, of the putative differences, have melted away. And I mean, as well as the fact that relevance theory does not just operate at a high level, nor does affective science relevance operate at a high level, just at a low level, because we often react emotionally to linguistic stimuli. And indeed, there has been a lot of work in affective science about how different levels of appraisal might interact and work in the elicitation of emotional episodes. So figure 1 is just sort of meant to show the picture as people in pragmatics and affective scientists work at the moment. But we're by no means do we think that that's the end of the story. We would like to think that, if the object of study between affective science and relevance theory, pragmatics, and pragmatics generally come closer together, then the sets that we've got in figure 1, which look to me, I mean, I find it slightly problematic for a number of reasons, which we possibly could talk about, but we probably want to be working towards a figure more like figure 2 or even figure 3. We might even want to be working towards a figure where we just have a circle, and that is pragmatics relevance and affective science relevance. But it's only the start of a collaboration, and though it's been a very exciting and fruitful one, we have more questions than answers currently. So I think it's 3 minutes past 6. I think I've spoken for about half an hour. If it's okay, I'd like to stop there and invite, well, I think Ryoko and Kate will invite questions. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Give people we've already got some hands going up. Constant was first by a millisecond.
No, it wasn't a question. It was just a clap sign.
Oh. Billy has definitely got a hand up.
Oh, I'm not going to answer any questions of somebody who hasn't clapped.
Thanks very much, Tim. I just want to start with a bit of a clarification question, I think, which is, it seems to me that the affective science relevance seems to involve a higher level assessment more than the relevance theory one does. So I think relevance theory doesn't rule out doing higher level assessments and thinking, I wonder what I think about that and so on. But in general, things are relevant because you start drawing conclusions and so on. Whereas the affective science one seems to have it as a more central thing that you're explicitly thinking, how does this relate to my goals? How does this relate to other things? So I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. Is that right? And
I'll pass on to Constant if I can, because that sounds like something that he's more likely to have thoughts on, because he works on affective science much more than I. If that's all right, Billy.
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Well, it's all right for me at least. Yeah, so it's true that the vocabulary used sounds like it's very intellectual and high processes of thoughts, but it's not how people see it in the affective sciences. It need not be explicit thinking at all. Rather, this is the kind of processes that we expect to happen in a very very early in the evolution, you know, so fish, for instance, are expected to have such processes, or even worms, perhaps, at least some of them. So yes, the idea is that it's very basic representations. You have certain goals that are somehow represented in your nervous system, and then some inputs either clash or not with these goals, and that's what starts the appraisal process. But yes, it's true. It's a usual criticism against appraisal theory that it's over intellectualizing emotional process. But I think it's not true anymore.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I didn't mean it as a criticism. I was just trying to work out what was going on.
Yeah. You need to pose. I think it seems like you need to posit these complex, well, rather complex representations in order to explain why two creatures can react differently to the same stimuli, meaning they don't have the same goals. So yes, they don't have the same goals. They don't represent themselves as having the same goal, and so that's why, like, one creature can be happy about a certain event while another would be sad about it, or be afraid of it, or be angry at it. And yeah, that's, yeah. So, I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments, you can feel free to type in the chat, or put your hand up, or shout, or unmute, or all three.
I could make another comment if nobody else is going to say anything, just while people are thinking.
Yeah,
It's occurring to me that in terms of our own personal goals, we often don't have them very salient to ourselves, which I think makes us a bit like the fish. But every now and then we start thinking explicitly about them, so that, you know, I mean, that's partly why psychoanalysis exists, because we're doing things. I wonder, why do I keep doing that? And I think it must be because I enjoy this or something. And I just wonder if there's anything. Anyway, it's not really a question. Just wonder if anybody else got any thoughts that relate to that.
I mean, I actually, Billy, I kind of identify with the point that you made about the about the complexity of the processes. And as Constant says, it is a complaint that lots of people have about appraisal theory, because you plainly feel that when you have an emotion, it's something that it doesn't feel like it's the response to a bunch of appraisals. It feels like it's just a pretty automatic response. But I mean, I just wonder if appraisal is, I mean, it's too late to change it, but it feels like perhaps the wrong word sometimes. But yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Deirdre, were you putting your hand up there to come in on that? Or was it just a round of applause? I'm confused.
Sorry, no, I was just trying to work out which was the way to raise my hand, and I've now established it, but Tom has got in first, and my next question is slightly different, so I'll come in later if that's okay.
Okay, Tom.
Oh, okay, nice to meet you, Tim, finally.
Hi, Tom, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you. So my question is kind of an invitation more than anything. So emotion and linguistic communication sometimes go together, right? So we express our emotions sometimes in a cold way, but often there's vocal expression of the emotion in the way that we raise it and so on. You must have discussed this with your collaborators. So how do you see the interaction between the two classical domains that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I'll say a little bit about that, and then maybe Constant will have something to add. I mean, yeah, well, as you know, I mean, I've been sort of thinking about how all this interacts with linguistic communication. And there's a huge literature, as you know, on expressivity and expressive meaning and things like this. Yeah, it's when you said it was an invitation, I looked at all those empty bottles on your cabinet behind you and thought it was going to be a different kind of invitation.
I'm sorry, they're all empty. They're 3 years worth of empty bottles.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated picture, isn't it? And it's very hard to try and separate it out. So in my work on emotion and communication, there are a whole bunch of largely relevance theoretic distinctions floating around between showing and meaning, between conceptual and procedural encoding. And I suppose, I mean, I've always, the idea of effective science having this notion of relevance at its heart came as a surprise to me, really, when I first discovered it 3 or 4 years ago. I mean, I suppose what we're working towards, and Constant may disagree with me on this, is a single notion of relevance, which is a relevance theoretic, is suitable with relevance theory, and effective scientists are agreed to it as well. And then somehow we can fuse, or at least integrate work, the highly developed work on the communication of moods and impressions and emotion in relevance theory with the kind of work in effective science, which often is not really related to communication at all. So it's simply related to the elicitation of emotional episodes on the basis of objects, whether they be threats or, objects that cause you happiness. So again, it's not really an answer, but I suppose what we're working towards is a single notion of relevance. And then that would enable us to tie in some way those two disciplines together in fruitful ways.
Kate, can I follow up quickly?
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that, or are you working towards a prediction that, so when we communicate, we have multiple affordances available to us, two of which are of linguistic utterance, language use, another of which is emotional expression, which can also be done with the voice. Yeah. And there's arms, there's bodies, and there's all sorts of affordances. Yeah. Perhaps we use those affordances optimally, right? And so when we express ourselves in an emotional way through our words, we're combining those two affordances in a potentially optimal way. Is that the sort of direction you're thinking?
That sounds pretty much like the direction I would be thinking of, yes. So, I mean, in my work, I've tried to integrate non-verbal behaviors both into ostensive communication, so you can kind of show them ostensively, and also I'm very interested in the way that they kind of operate below the surface, as it were. Somehow we sort of subconsciously and non-reflectively absorb meanings and things that people are communicating with us. So yes, I think that relevance theory, I mean, it has been used a lot with verbal communication, obviously, but there's much more to verbal communication than language, and there's much more to linguistic communication than language. So I think, yeah, what was the phrase that you used? We use them optimally, or?
I mean, I'm not even sure if I want to use optimal or efficient, or there's a few different choices here. But it seems to me that there are a whole bunch of affordances that we have available to us, and we combine them in various ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that sounded like a very interesting. I'm not sure if optimal is the right word either, but yes, I think there's potential for a lot of work together, and bringing all of the numerous communicative behaviors that people use into a sort of coherent. I don't know if Constant, if you have anything to add to that to Tom's question. That's really.
So I just maybe rather on something you said before about whether the two notions are gonna converge into one notion. The main obstacle I see to this is the fact that in effective sciences, the relevance we're talking about can be about very diverse goals. And it seems to me that in relevance theory, we'd rather talk about the goal to improve our cognitive representations, to gain positive cognitive effects, and also to minimize, to minimize effort, to perhaps maximize our energy. So those are the two main goals we talk about. But for instance, if you are in the forest and you see a snake, you are afraid because allegedly you would see it as relevant to your goal of being safe, and you see this goal as being urgently, endangered, and you see yourself as having perhaps a low coping potential if you don't know how to deal with snakes, if you are not used to snakes, and these goals, they don't seem to have much to do with cognitive improvement. And when you see the snake, you see it as relevant, but you don't see it as an opportunity to improve, your cognitive effects necessarily. But that's a potential. But perhaps there is another interpretation that may be closer to the use of relevance in a relevance theory. But yeah, that's my worry about the merging potential of these two notions, that perhaps there are other goals that affective science talk about than the goals that relevance theories talk about.
Thank you. Deirdre was next in the queue. Got a little line of people.
Sorry about my inadequacy. It was a bit of a follow-up to the discussion that just happened. And actually, one of the things that relevance theory has always claimed is that you can be relevant by implying plans for action. And in the snake case, that you're going to get relevance via plans for action to kill the snake or whatever. So I think there is a possible rapprochement there. But I've been thinking, prompted partly by what Tim said and partly by what Tom said, about sort of more direct ways you might bring the two notions of relevance together. One possibility is that the effective type of relevance may affect the cognitive type of relevance by affecting processing cost. If Tim was talking about epistemic notions of epistemic emotions in connection with relevance. There's things you want to know, and there are some things you don't want to know. And if you think about that, the way they affect your cognition is by making you eager to process in one direction and reluctant to process in another. And that could come out in terms of processing cost. So that's another way. It's a bit of an imperialist way, because it sort of it subsumes certain types of emotion into the notion of processing cost. But I think there is something to explore there. And the other thought I had was just that emotions have a cognitive content, and you don't want to divorce, clearly, emotions from cognition. So there might be ways of incorporating cognition and emotion again under the same umbrella. But I thought Tim's talk was really exciting, and I think there are important directions it points in. So that's all. Thank you.
I think if I could just respond quickly to Deirdre. Yes, I mean, Deirdre's absolutely right that there is that emotion is about cognition as well. I mean, and perhaps presenting this talk in the way that I did suggested or implied that emotion was on one side and the higher epistemic stuff was on the other. Of course, that's not true at all. And in fact, for something to be an emotion, it has to have a cognitive content as well. Otherwise, it's not a full-fledged emotion. And there's all sorts of interesting people who've written very interesting stuff about that. In fact, in particular, the quote at the top of the handout by Ronald D'Souza, that book is a really interesting exploration of this kind of myth that has perpetuated study, that emotion and cognition are two different things, two separate things. Anyway, but thank you, Deirdre. Ryoko has said she can't raise her hand because she's the host.
It's all right. I know where she is in the queue for a question, so it's okay. Angie, you're next.
Hi. Lately, I have been spending a lot of time thinking about the whole of emotion in the inferential process because of my research. I was talking to Claire Wharton a couple of times, and she, regarding news, it has been established that people deal with news in an emotional way. Uh, every kind of new information and social media relies a lot on eliciting emotion to promote some kind of relevance. But I was thinking more specifically of a recent study by Pennycock and Brandt. They took around 4,000 people and they induce them to think about some misinformation in an emotional way. And they realize that when people face news and are induced in an emotional way, there is more reliance on fake news, more belief in fake news. So this has been a conundrum for me. How can we, establish a way to understand the inferential process on basis on this now that it has been tested and it's clear when you induce emotion, your belief in information changes. It's more accepted. He had 4,000 cases. I don't know if you have been also talking about this constant, I don't know, or Tim, if you could shed some other light about this inferential process. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there's, I'm Constant may well have more to add to this. I was reading, this book, which is, oh, can you see it? Thinking Fast and Slow. Yeah, there you go. Rapido y devagar. I mean, that's got some very nice examples of this kind of idea that if you have this emotional feeling of comfort or ease, then I mean, Kahneman talks about it in terms of these two systems, doesn't he? System 1 and System 2, and System 2 is basically, lazy and wants to just go along with System 1. So I don't really have that much knowledge of what the examples that you're talking about, but emotionally, a positive emotion certainly prompts us to accept certain types of information, even though we're not necessarily sure where that positive feeling comes from. And that's kind of how a lot of fake news is perpetuated, I think. Constant, do you have anything to add?
I'm not exactly sure, of what emotional states you're talking about. Is it like all emotional states in which you would be that would make you more likely to believe fake news, or certain kind of states?
No, he worked with some specific kinds because he developed a list where with anger and he, according to each one of these feelings, that's studied in psychology, that would elicit some kind of extra emotion. But no matter what of these in the list that he applied, it always led to more reliance on fake news. But I was thinking a little further because I really would like to use relevance theory in this, interpretation, and it has been hard for me to join the two concepts to analyze the inferential process, and go a little further. It's a little more clear now.
I mean, I think there are still a few people with questions. If you want to email me about that, Angie, I'm happy to communicate about it. I don't know whether I have any answers, but I could try.
Brilliant. Thank you. Meng Yang, you're next.
Yes. Hi. I guess this is kind of a naive question, but I was thinking about the cases where you may experience two or several emotional states at the same time. So for example, when reading a piece of literary work, there's this so-called bittersweet, or you might feel sad, but at the same time content. So I was just thinking, how would relevance fit into this sort of cases? So is there any, is there a kind of competition in terms of how much cognitive effort I should spend on delivering this kind of emotional state and how much to delivering the other? So I was just thinking, how can we use relevance to explain this sort of fusion of different emotions?
Yeah. Constant, do you have any? Haven't thought about fused emotions, but since I feel them most of the time, I should have done.
I mean, the fiction cases are very complex cases, I think, for emotion theory. But yes, so from the standpoint of affective sciences, if you read something that makes you sad, but at the same time you are happy to read something that is sad because you enjoy the novel or whatever, you would analyze the relevance to different goals. So you perhaps have the fictional goal that to not lose someone dear in the fiction, and then when that happens, that will trigger sadness. But at the same time, you also have the goal as a reader to I don't know, have some drama going on and some entertaining, plot. And so the fact that someone dies in the plot fulfills that goal, and so is relevant to another goal, the goal of enjoying reading something, right? So yeah, that's how I would try to go. I would try to go in this direction to answer your question. Perhaps I don't know if it answers it relevantly, but
yeah, I mean, so in the case of fiction in particular, it's you've got lots of different goals and you're entertaining them all at the same time. There's a very good book came out a couple of years ago about relevance theory and literature. I've got it somewhere. But that Reading Beyond the Code answers a lot of questions about those kind of issues, Meng Yang. And I think we're meeting tomorrow anyway, aren't we? So perhaps we can talk about it then as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Agnieszka.
Hello, thanks for the so inspiring talk. And I keep wondering, and sorry if my idea is a little too far-fetched, but nevertheless I will present it, because I was thinking to what extent we can seriously expand the list of goals within relevance theory, because so far we have talked about maximizing cognitive effects, minimizing processing effort. But on the other hand, when in 1995 Sperber and Wilson dropped communicative effects and replaced them by cognitive effects, right? I think this is some kind of a welcoming move to admit like other goals which are more human related, so to speak. And I was wondering whether we can sort of openly admit, I don't know, the goal like to be happy or to maintain well-being as something that guides processing, right? Something that affects comprehension. And I'm not really sure, but maybe just a little evidence towards this direction would be reasoning biases. okay, the fact that we use heuristics, we follow heuristic in comprehension. So we do maximize cognitive gains, but relative to something else, to some other goals. So I'm just wondering to what extent we can sort of openly and explicitly talk about other goals within relevance theory.
Yeah. Well, I think part of that question was answered by Deirdre when she pointed out that, of course, relevance can also be achieved in, I think the phrase she used was plans for action. I mean, yeah, I have huge sympathy with a central goal being to be happy, and part of yeah, I think part of the discussions that we've had as a collaborative team has revolved a lot around the section in relevance theory where they talk about, where Dan and Deirdre talk about improving one's representation of the world, and just how far you can stretch that, whether that includes issues other than just representational issues, so perhaps affective issues and attitudinal issues and things. I don't know if, do you have, Constant, do you have any more thoughts on that?
I'm not entirely clear, to be honest, on this question. I like the idea that relevance to plans for actions can be a way to deal with this idea. So, for instance, you are at the station and you want to take a train and you have the board in front of you. And so the info that's going to be relevant to you is the most relevant one is going to be the one that's about the train you want to take, because you want to go see your partner, and that's about happiness. And so maybe that's why it's the most relevant information, because in the end you want to go see your partner, and so that's the train you need to take. And so the information that's most relevant is the one about that train. So there is a strong link, right, between certain further goals and the goal to gain certain cognitive effects. But I don't know exactly how to think about that clearly. So I'd love to know what Deirdre would have to say if she had more thoughts to share about that, because yeah, that's something that I'd love to know more about, think more about.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say something about that, Deirdre.
Somebody just said something in the chat. So a positive cognitive effect is a worthwhile change of a person's representation. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's
so
nice.
The worthwhile part can directly be plugged into the conducive to well-being or something like that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, that's great.
Brilliant. If people are happy to stay on for a couple of more minutes, I think Ryoko has a question, but she couldn't put her hand.
Yeah, it's very, very silly question, so you can maybe answer in 10 seconds. But I don't want to keep everyone there too long. But just wondered if you could clarify how you define emotion as opposed to affect, because I've been working on the eye tracking and so on, and in reception studies, they're more like to think about affect in terms of response, reaction, and repercussions, and so on. And with the snake example, I was thinking, to some extent, the first emotional affective reaction is very instant, and we might not even realize what emotion we have. So we might have a snake and we get really scared, but we might not even realize that we are scared. So we are talking sort of pre-cognition level response. While if you start thinking, oh, the goal is this, and or needs is that concept, that seems much more sort of refined, almost like conceptual representation like emotion. So I just wanted to I just wanted to check which side of affect or emotion or response you're talking about there.
Constant, I think we'll have more to say.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't get the last bit. You said that the what we have been talking about seems to be more refined than the very basic effects that you may have in front of a snake before you are afraid, even before you realize you're afraid.
You know, I think it seems to me that there are different levels of different levels. I don't know if it's levels or not. When we say emotion, at some stage we may be feeling something very, very basic, primitive, which is not even, which is very difficult to put into words, if you will. While after a while you may be able to discuss, you can represent what it is more concretely in a concrete conceptual terms. So in that sense, I kind of find that when we say emotion, it seems very broad to me. And they also discuss affect quite a lot in reception studies. So I just wondered which end of emotion you're discussing, or do we need to just treat emotion per se?
I tend to think of affect as broader than emotion. I think affect encompasses things like mood and
pains, pleasures, desires.
Whereas emotions are these kind of specific, often short-term reactions to objects. That's like emotions. And affect is something much, much broader. At least that's how I understand it.
Yep. Yes. So most people think that the appraisals that the appraisal theorists, most appraisal theorists would think that the appraisals that are mentioned on the handout, like congruence or just equalization, etc., they are involved in most affects. So not only in emotions, but also in moods, even pains and pleasures. So desires, sentiments, long-term sentiments, like for instance, disposition to be afraid of snakes or whatever, or a long-time hatred or whatever, which might not qualify as an emotion because emotions are punctual. But all of those different affects would be theorized through also the appraisals that we have been talking about. So don't know if it clarifies a little bit.
So it sounds like there are different theories with different definition of affect and emotion.
Yes, definitely, yes. So I'm talking about from the perspective of appraisal theory, which we've been using in this talk.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to just check what you meant by this. So yeah, it was a very quick confirmation question. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. A lot of people leaving now, and it's we run over time. So unless you have burning desire to well, if that's the case, you can always email Tim and Constant.
Well, we'll put the blog onto the website with the recording. We